Good morning. Thank you. Sorry, good morning if you're on the Pacific Coast. Good afternoon if you're in Europe. Thank you for making the time to join us for this webinar where we will be discussing the future of Europe's auto and battery industry. We have approximately 40 minutes of discussion and then 10 minutes towards the end for Q&A. My name is Isabelle Duprat. I'm the Deputy Director of EYES, the European Initiative for Energy Security, a think tank that was incubated by SAFE, established in Brussels in 2023. EYES works on shaping solutions that de-risk Europe's energy transition, address and mitigate strategic dependencies, and improve Europe's security and prosperity. Our approach is centered on establishing a shared understanding of risks across industry, policymakers, and our militaries to inform regulation and capital allocation. Our roots are in an organization that has championed transportation electrification as a means of achieving energy security and domestic security, ending problematic dependencies on fossil fuels. We care deeply about getting this issue right for Europe to reassert its sovereign capability in auto and battery making. This is not just about manufacturing cars in Europe for the sake of European jobs and preserving our cultural legacy. This is about the strategic importance of the automotive sector for our technological and strategic autonomy. The interdependencies of the automotive sector with upstream minerals and metal supply chains, including steel and aluminium, present opportunities for bolstering growth across strategic sectors like defense, clean tech, high-tech components like semiconductors. We, as EYES, are grateful to have collaborated with Michael Dunne on this paper. The paper sets out challenges posed by China's vertically integrated automotive supply chains, systemic non-market practices, and predatory pricing models. It sets forth a roadmap that includes investment support, deeper upstream supply chain integration, and defensive measures to ensure that we're able to prioritize a made-in-Europe approach, and partnership models with aligned countries, and that Europeans can stand to gain from the influx of foreign investment into the continent. A lot is at stake, but the upside can be huge if we're able to harness this momentum into action. We have a new political agenda in Europe that we'll discuss later, centered on industrial independence that seeks to mobilize 100 billion euros to support clean tech manufacturing, among other things. On top of that, the strategic dialogue on the future of the automotive industry was launched at the end of January and will culminate next week with the launch of the Automotive Action Plan. I'm pleased to introduce Michael Dunne, an esteemed expert on China's automotive sector who has spent a large chunk of his career in Asia, including leading GM in Indonesia and advising many global automotive companies. He's also the author of Automotive Wheels and Chinese Roads, and founder of Dunne Insights, which authored the report. Michael, during the time that we were working on this report, there was an acknowledgement by the Commission of Unfair Competition from China, but we still have disagreements across Europe about what the problem is and what we can do about it. Can you share your assessment of the problem and state of the playing field in Europe for its automotive and battery sector?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Isabel. First off, thank you very much for the opportunity to join this important initiative at an important time for Europe. I think to set the table a little bit, historians will definitely look back at the period from 2020 to 2025 as one of monumental change in the global auto industry, and that change's epicenter was China. Think of it as almost an industrial earthquake. That earthquake centered in China has created a tsunami of waves of change throughout the global auto industry, including, of course, Europe. Three massive tremors. One, EVs as a share of total sales in China went from just 6% in 2020 to 50% last year. In real numbers, that's from 1 million cars a year to 10 million. China now builds more EVs and batteries than the rest of the world combined. That's just happened in 5 years. The second one is that global automakers' share in China has collapsed from 60% of the total market to 30%. That means almost 8 million cars a year in lost sales And Volkswagen is probably taking the biggest hit, 1 million units a year. In just 4 years, they've lost 1 million units of sales a year in China. That's the second shock. And the third one, and probably the most important for our purposes, is that China now has capacity supply half of global demand for cars of all types. Half. And last year, China's exports reached 6 million cars, up from only 1 million in 2020. So the upshot of all of this is that we see an unprecedented number of Chinese automakers pushing exports out into markets worldwide, including Europe. And by the end of last year, Chinese share of the European market went from practically zero in 2020 to a solid 5%. Mm-hmm. So Europe has to look in the mirror and say, what's going on with this earthquake and how can we defend ourselves? And so two things come to mind. One, powering this Chinese export offensive, of course, is something called state capitalism, where there are subsidies and state support that make Chinese cars 25% less expensive than those manufactured anywhere else. What can Europe do about it? On the one hand, Europe's leverage is a massive market that Chinese want access to. On the other hand, Europe's weakness is a lack of urgency and unified goal and a sense of, right now, this is an existential moment. We have to really get a sense of purpose, rally our capabilities and capital and the right policies in order to be competitive going forward.
Thank you, Michael. And turning to Fabrice. Fabrice is the Director of Government Affairs for Electromobility Projects at EMEA, but joins us today in his capacity as Secretary General of BEPA, the Batteries European Partnership Alliance. Fabrice, Europe has nonetheless not been sitting completely idle. Europe was once at the forefront of innovation in the cathode space specifically, and prior to the Inflation Reduction Act was ahead of the United States on battery manufacturing output. Can you talk us through, from the business perspective, through the developments that have affected the competitive landscape in Europe?
Yes, so thank you once again for having me on this webinar. Michael talked about his storybook. I also want to maybe look a bit behind. If you remember well, in 2017, there was already a wake-up call at European level, and we ended up with the European Battery Alliance that was set up under the leadership of Vice President Šefčovič in the time to try to get our act together and try to have the emergence and the strengthening of a battery value chain. Of course, in 2020, COVID came. Then 2022, invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Then the Inflation Reduction Act as an American answer to the inflation. And then at some point in Europe also, I would say there's a bit of a stagnation of the sales of EVs due to the fact that some member states could not afford anymore helping the development of the market. So these are the couple of things that have maybe shaped not only the battery value chain, but all clean tech value chains that we cannot ignore. And now we see Europe yesterday with the Clean Industrial Deal having a second attempt, I would say, and we hope for the best, of course. In terms of challenges that our industry is facing, and it's always very difficult to come up with a summary of challenges because depending on where you are in the battery value chain, it may be different. But I think we can summarize it into what I call the 4S. There is an issue with the scope of the operations and technologies. Some companies have tried to do maybe too much in the past. It's about finding the right scope of operations. But we also see now that there are more than one, just one battery technology. And that's also putting some pressure on what scope do you want to cover as a company. The second S is related to the scale of the investments and their profitability. This is a globally growing market. So if you want to maintain a strong market share and if you want to build your market share, you need to grow as fast as the global market. And these are quite important CapEx programs that we have to deal with. In the same time, sometimes the market may not be growing as fast as needed, or there may be some legal uncertainties as to whether the market will be growing as much as we want it to grow. And the third S is actually about speed speed of developing your operations, but also speed of adapting to the market and innovating. It is a well-known fact that permitting in Europe is very slow compared to other parts of the world. This is, of course, something that you cannot ignore. And then the last one is about sustainability. The mantra in Europe is about let's be as sustainable as possible. Sometimes we may have to ask ourselves, when is going green going too green? And is it still a key success factor, or is it actually making some difficulties? So these are the industrial challenges that we are now going through, and which are, I would say, shaping, Isabel, the competitive landscape that we see in Europe.
That's great. Thank you so much, Fabrice. I love the 4 S's, scope, speed, scale, and sustainability. Coming over to Jos, so Jos Dings has deep expertise in European clean tech supply chains and policy, having led transport and environment for almost 13 years after moving to the dark side to join Tesla as Director of Public Policy and Business Development in the EMEA region. Jos, the regulatory side has been focused on questions of transparency and environmental standards, as we discussed, and most recently with the introduction of non-price criteria in the Clean Industrial Deal, but typically more sticks than carrots. What are the challenges with the current approach, and are we over leveraged in certain domains potentially?
Thanks, Isabel. I'm also excited to be part of this very timely seminar. Yeah, I think it's fair to say that Europe was slow in waking up to the problem that Michael laid out very eloquently. And I think what von der Leyen did in September 2013, announcing an investigation into subsidization of Chinese EVs, was a surprise to almost anybody in the room, not only substantively, but also politically, that she was taking that step. And I think that leadership is sometimes underappreciated. And I think it was the first step in Europe waking up to what's actually going on. That's the way sometimes these things work. You need a political step to make people aware. So if you look at what's really needed now in the current circumstances, I don't have 4 S's. I have sort of a holy trinity, if you like. I call it make, buy, protect Europe, right? So make Europe take care of the supply side, especially through reforming state aid. Buy Europe by indeed being much smarter about the way we give our domestic industries a head start in our procurement policies, be it public or private. And protect, well, as the word says, that's primarily about trade. It's the last of the trinity, because trade cannot improve the competitiveness of the industry. It can just deal with a sort of external challenges. So, in my view, it's the last, and the Commission started there. So the other 2 are still to be tackled. So yesterday, the Clean Industrial Deal came out. Nobody expected any legally binding proposals in there, and that was indeed the case. It was more a statement of intent, on state aid, right? It does make some suggestions. A big problem that Europe has been having is that state aid, especially for big projects, has always been about project by project, right? So a company submits a proposal, it ends up into endless negotiations with the Commission, and maybe 2 years later we have a bit of clarity, on your plan, which is simply too late. The world has moved on by then, and the plan has already changed, right? So we need to move to a more default way. If you do this, you can expect this in terms of public support. And yes, indeed, the Inflation Reduction Act is in that sense a lot more predictable. And the communication yesterday takes one step in that direction. The step that less reassures me is that it still talks about increasing battery manufacturing capacity instead of increasing battery manufacturing full stop, right? So the problem is not that we don't have the capacity. The problem is that the factories, are not finished or not built. right? And because a lot of our state aid is lump sum. And again, the Inflation Reduction Act and a lot of the Chinese way of stimulating business is simply providing, cheap capital to stimulate production, right? And IRA is explicitly production based, so the marginal cost of producing in China and the US simply lower than in the EU. And so it's only a statement of intent. The state aid guidelines are coming out in June. There's a lot of room to change things still, but over there I don't yet see the movement needed. And then when we come to Buy Europe, I don't want to take up all the time. It's a complicated subject. Do you use green as a proxy or not for European, or do you simply say European preference? These are super important questions that we need to start grappling with. And again, it takes some cautious steps in the right direction, but knowing Europe, it will take a lot of debate to settle this.
That's great. Thank you. And in terms of the nature of the support that is needed, you talked about, operational support, OpEx, in addition to lump sum. I would love to hear from the rest of the panel. What's the problem that, whether you agree with that being the problem that we're looking to solve for, and what might be some other sort of funding pools that we can dip into. Maybe I can turn to Michael first.
Can I say one more thing, Isabel? It's not so much about OpEx, it's about output. So aid should be as little as possible cost-based, because if it's cost-based, you reward the costly things, right? What you want is to reward the efficient things. So it should be output and performance-based more than cost-based, right? And so yes, there's a relationship to OpEx, but it's still an important nuance.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It might be helpful to look for a moment at how the U.S. has responded to this challenge coming out of China. So to state some things that are in the headlines, first off, there's that 100% tariff on Chinese EVs. So basically here in the United States, unlike Europe, you just don't see Chinese cars on the road. There's like, okay, time out, buy time, our industry's not ready, we don't want imports. So the tariff is there on finished cars. And then in addition to that, during the Biden administration, they said, what do we have in terms of industrial capabilities to compete with the Chinese when it comes to batteries? Do we have anything? Oh, basically, our cupboards were bare. So we put forth policies that stimulated $100 billion in fresh investments into battery plants across the Midwest and Southeast of the United States, $100 billion, they call it the battery belt. Those are mostly joint ventures between automakers and partners out of Japan and Korea, battery partners. One Chinese company, AESC, is also there. But the major takeaway was that the government incentivized investments in manufacturing under the IRA, and by all intents and purposes, that was pretty successful. It's the largest single industrial investment scheme that we've seen in the last, I don't know, since the 1960s. So first step, establish that manufacturing battery footprint in the country. Now the next step is, how do we build out the supply chains that go into those battery facilities where the final battery is assembled? That's where we are in the United States. And I'd like to imagine a similar policy for Europe where, I don't know, maybe an Airbus type project where you say Europe goes, in order to compete with these two giants, United States and China, we have to have scale. And scale means unifying under in a single purpose to build a world-class battery manufacturing company with supplies here within Europe. And in order to get there, you really need to attract that private capital. The Koreans, the Japanese, and the Americans responded here in North America. And I think with the right incentives, they do the same thing in Europe.
Thank you. And I wanted to maybe let Jos respond to the question of the production tax credits that we had discussed the other day, and their impact on Europe.
Yeah. Well, first off, they are very substantial, right? In the Inflation Reduction Act, we're talking about 35 dollars per kilowatt hour if you produce cells, which at current cell prices is approximating half of the actual production cost. And who knows, maybe in 5 years it covers the full production cost, right? So it is generous, but the most important thing is that it's actually targeted towards what we want, right? Which is output, right? And not towards what we don't want, which is cost and, buildings and stuff like that. We want output, we want performance, right? This is super important. And the second thing that the IRA does, maybe the consumption credits more than the production credits even, is make the support conditional on localization of the supply chain, right? And there's positive and negative localization. It includes certain. It says, okay, free trade agreement partners can also be a part of what we call, local supply, and it says certain entities of concern cannot be part of it, right? That's and that's a bridge that Europe so far has never crossed, right? Explicitly mentioning, from which jurisdictions you're welcoming cooperation and for which jurisdictions you're not welcoming cooperation, right? And yeah, but some way we need to cross that bridge. Europe so far has always tried to do this through environmental, standards. If you're green, it doesn't matter where you come from. We like you, right? And that policy has largely failed, right? Except a few examples where it was a little bit cheated, to be frank. The French have said we only want green EVs, and then the way they define green is by simply putting in the calculation methodology that if it comes from Europe, it has a lower carbon footprint, right? You cannot change that in the calculation methodology. Then it works, right? But it's the only example that works that I know of. So, if you want to stimulate European content, you can still do it through sort of green criteria, but you need to be quite savvy about how you implement it. And from all the practice that I've seen so far, we have mostly not been terribly savvy, right? So yeah, we need to put in both in buy and make Europe, so both in state aid and in buy Europe, we need to put in conditionality as to content from which countries we like and countries for which and content for which countries we don't like, and we need to be quite savvy about our green criteria, more savvy than we have been so far.
And in terms of Fabrice, did you want to respond also to the question of funding and pools that was originally posed?
I like the made in Europe. I also sometimes say innovated in Europe, because we should not forget that there is a very competitive technological frontier in front of us. I always like to say it's not just a sprint, it's also a marathon, because this competition on finding the right technologies for electrification, they are going to be with us for a long time. It's not something that's going to have just for a few years. It's going to be with us for a long time. Now, from an innovation guy, you would expect, of course, a bit on innovation, which is about preparing for the future. Of course, we have to fix the present, but the future is still to be considered. I believe that we need to do more. I mean, in Europe, I did a small back of the envelope calculation. If you take the R&D budget of the biggest battery maker in the world, I think you will easily understand who it is. It is actually their R&D budget, private company, higher than the public funding towards battery research made available by European Commission and all the European member states together. So that shows you how far we are from delivering on the ambitions. I always say, if you have limited budgets, you can only have limited ambitions. And so this is really what we need to try to break, is that people have to understand that to innovate and then to industrialize, this is actually an expensive endeavor. And there is no way around. You need to put the money on the table. Yesterday, the Clean Industrial Deal, as Jos said, it's quite inventive in terms of money. I hope it will be not too much repackaged money, because this is sometimes the risk that we see. But for example, I was looking at this facility called the Flagship the European Commission says we're going to have 600 million euro to help make projects ready for deployment. And this is going to be spread between clean tech and industrial decarbonization. That means that 300 million are going to be made available for 2 years, spread over batteries, hydrogen, solar, wind. So basically, how can you create impact and reach a strong technological leadership if you do not put enough money on the table? That's for me something I always struggle to understand.
Major discrepancies in R&D and innovation that are holding us back.
Yes.
And while the question of tariffs has put a pretty sour taste in everyone's mouth recently, you know, when we're allocating capital towards this, and Jos, you alluded to this earlier, we need to consider how we are defending European interests and precisely products that we're manufacturing that also align with our values and way of doing things. It's delicate, and there are loopholes that need addressing. But Michael, we included this in the report, and I wanted to ask you what a tariff schedule on batteries might look like.
Right. Tariffs are definitely the flavor of the year right now globally, especially with the Trump administration. I want to just share just very briefly my experience in Asia with regard to tariffs. People forget that Japan, Korea, China, they're the masters of tariffs and non-tariff barriers. So in my 25 years in Asia, imports as a share of car markets in those three countries never exceeded 7%. Almost everything that's sold in those countries is manufactured in those countries. That's not a coincidence. There's something going on there. There's a master plan to say we will have a very strong industrial base in our own country, we'll export, and we will minimize what we allow to come into our markets. So today, when we hear about the United States putting in place tariffs, of course, there's an outcry. Whoa, wait a second. How come the U.S. is getting so protectionist? In fact, the U.S. has been an outlier. Last year, the United States imported 8 million cars, half of our market. And that's pretty generous. In China, they imported 720,000 cars, about 3% of their market. Okay, so you get my point. It's tariffs isn't full stop, just, let's penalize the people exporting to the United States. It's an incentive to have people come and manufacture inside that given territory. So we come back to batteries in Europe. How do we incentivize manufacturing inside Europe? That is higher tariffs on finished batteries. Absolutely need it. Otherwise, the Chinese will overwhelm the market with their exports. And then much lower tariffs on the inputs that go into manufacturing of batteries in Europe. Specifically, what I mean by that, I've been an investor and advisor to battery startups here in the United States. And the lesson learned was the tariffs were too high on the inputs. Let's not penalize the inputs. Okay, we'll bring in the inputs in the short term in order to allow us to blossom our homegrown manufacturing. That's the dual track when it comes to batteries and tariffs.
So a mechanism that doesn't penalize the work that we've already done, but also ensures that we're able to compete against oligopolistic structures.
That's right.
And I like the framing of why don't we see this as an opportunity rather than something that is more aggressive by looking at other precedents. Fabrice, did you want to come in on the question of tariffs?
I'm not really a trade policy specialist like Michael, so the only thing that's coming through my mind is trade barriers, they're only as good as the enforcement, and we know that loopholes are, of course, part of this. Also, that it has to be part of a toolkit, for sure. It should not be the only policy, and we need to, as Jos said, this is not a solution to competitiveness, because you also need to do your homework in Europe at learning how to do batteries, because today we are still on the experience curve. So it will still need a lot of sweat and tears and money to be able to make the batteries that are fulfilling the market requirements. And so for me, at some point, we also have to take into account that trade barriers are here. They may grow, but they may also reduce in size. And so if you did not take the time to build your technological leadership, then you are back at square one. So it's part of toolkit, but I always argue for technological leadership development at the same time.
I want to. Jos, did
Maybe
you
I
want to
can
jump
add
in?
one element also to the equation, right? When it comes to tariffs, I mean, we have a really funny situation that President Trump can talk about nothing but tariffs and how they will make America rich with the revenues, right? And in Europe, tariffs are only seen as a burden and something that makes stuff more expensive. But of course, the truth is somewhere in the middle. Yes, they make stuff more expensive, but there's also revenue, right? And no matter where you turn it, you will need to raise some revenue in order to finance, the other parts of the plan, right? So it cannot just be carrots. It cannot just be sticks. It needs to be a mix. And the problem with Europe's trade policy at the moment is that it's always piecemeal, because the trade defense instruments are case by case, right? And then you get a bit of a cat and mouse situation that you levy a tariff on one thing, and then there is some kind of evasion or circumvention to another country or another product code or whatever, and you have an anti-circumvention case and blah blah blah. So you need to figure out a way to have a little bit more, a broad ranging, policy that sort of preemptively you already address the circumvention rather than later on. Fabrice is also talking about these loopholes. I guess we're talking about the same thing, right? That you preemptively make sure that there won't be loopholes to exploit that you subsequently need to catch, right? But we do, even financially, we do need a mix of carrots and sticks. The carrots are just unaffordable and sticks are just unacceptable. So we need a mix of both.
Yeah, framework and anti-circumvention measures and considerations for spillover effects. There was a great question that came in through the Q&A prior to the webinar, which was about, how are we? Is it not too late to solely try to compete with China, and are we not better off also trying to collaborate? And this is a topic that we touched on in the paper, to say, okay, let's be pragmatic about this foreign investment coming into Europe, and how can we capture some of the benefits for Europeans. And Michael, maybe I'll let you present some of the recommendations in the report in terms of joint ventures and tech transfer.
Right, thank you. So if we step back and think about where Europe has the greatest leverage vis-a-vis China, it's access to the European market. Chinese automakers and battery makers have massive overcapacity at home and are thirsty, hungry for access to markets where they can grow and make profits. And Europe is one of those big targets for them. So if I'm a European negotiator, I say, how do I leverage this to my advantage? If we think back about how China itself did it in the mid-2010s, I remember LG Chem came in and said, we'd love to establish a battery manufacturing plant in China. We know you guys want to go electric. Can we get in? And China said, great, yeah, absolutely. It'll take some months. We'll eventually approve your license, but you can build your plant here, but you cannot supply to the domestic market. Sorry, you'll have to export for the first few years. So that's if we use our imagination, anything's possible. What we want to do is say, let's be realistic. We want to build our own independent, strong European battery industry. How do we get there? Today, China is the overwhelming heavyweight in the business. So invite them in, allow them access to the European market, but at a cost. And that cost would be any Chinese battery maker that wants to manufacture in Europe must form a joint venture with a European entity. That ownership should be 50% or more European, and there should be strings attached with regards to R&D tech transfer. Not just on paper, but there should be a vigilant tracking of here's the schedule for technology transfer over the next 3 years. We'll revisit it quarterly, and we'll make sure that those are actually happening. That's exactly the playbook that China used, and there's no reason why Europe can't use the very same one. Be smart, be practical, but also remain in charge of the ultimate outcomes, just as China did.
Could I add to that? I fully agree that leverage is the concept that is missing in European thinking, right? So what Michael says is completely necessary, but I would say we can even expand on it, and we haven't used it at all, actually, until this moment. We haven't even differentiated our state aid, right? Anybody who settles down in Europe can get state aid, irrespective of how the factory is run, how the IP is being dealt with, how it's being managed, who the leadership is, all these things that Michael mentioned. The rules for receiving public money are in principle the same for anybody. I would say that's another leverage tool that we need to start using. And if the policing of a joint venture, as Michael sets out, is, turns out that the conditions are not respected, you need to pay back the money, right? And the same for Buy Europe, right? So if you don't respect the conditions in the joint venture in practice, then you are not part of a Buy Europe scheme anymore, right? And so this, it's simply the world where the world is moving to, more transactional and leverage type kind of thinking. And you're being a peace prospect in its origins, and it's also a reason why I'm such a big fan, right? For the first time, a supranational institution has been built up with enormous jurisdiction without major conflicts to going there purely voluntarily. So it's fantastic, but we need to adapt to the times, and we need to use leverage, which is the market, absolutely number one, but also our legal tools. We need to use them to increase that leverage and simply ask quid pro quo.
Important. If I talk to the Chinese manufacturers, the thing that they're most intimidated by is, we will have to comply with some independent legal system that can't be influenced or bought off. That's enormous leverage. Hey, you're in our house now, Europe. We have our standards and our rules. You must abide by them. And there's legal implications and repercussions. That's big.
At least I wanted to also give you the opportunity to respond.
Yeah, maybe zooming out a bit on the technology gap between Europe and China, or Europe and Asia. Of course, you have to look at the battery value chain as being consisting of various pieces. So what we are now talking about is the midstream, so the battery cell making. Now, if you look at what is upstream, the active materials, I think we know how to make them. We have a great leadership in technology. When it comes to the downstream, which is the battery recycling, we know very well how to recycle batteries. We just need to have batteries to recycle, if I may say it bluntly. It's mostly the gap is mostly on the middle stream, where we are still learning how to make batteries. We suffer from huge scrap rate, while Chinese players have actually parts per millions maybe of defaults. So there's a long way to go. So we need to catch up on that, and every measures that help, of course, should be considered in details. What I want also to say is that we also have to keep on thinking about the next horizons. You may see now there's a lot of discussions on solid state batteries, which are seen to be the next frontier. It's still very expensive batteries for very expensive cars. But at some point, these technologies become less expensive. By the way, they can already be used for defense applications. That's also something not to be forgotten. And there we are having quite a lead with Japan, I would say, on these chemistries. But in the field, China is investing massively. The amounts that they are investing is extremely important, and the catch-up competition is now on. And the race is on, and we need to run that race. Now on collaboration, as you were asking, Isabel, well, it's difficult it's difficult to say no. Of course, we should be always open to collaboration. The question is, of course, the conditions and the terms and the reference of these collaborations. What I see, I think it was the point of Jos, there is not a lot of conditionality to unlocking state aid. So it's all in the hands of the member states, and then this is being green-lighted or not by the competition authorities in Brussels. But of course, the member states may have a different approach to state aid. So you can easily play one member state against the other, and then it's a race to the bottom, I would say. So there's a need maybe for a reinforcement and clarity on the state aid law. There is an update that is supposed to come under the form of a clean industrial deal state aid framework. I haven't gone into the text yet in details, but this is maybe the place where such conditionalities should be formulated, because you need a legal basis for that.
I'm sure that Jos, you have dug into the state aid question, as this is your baby, so to speak. Did you want to respond?
Believe me, when I was young, I never thought I was that somebody would mention the state it would be my baby. But yeah, I don't have so much more to add to what Fabrice is saying. It's true that Chinese companies also choose member states based on how favorable the CCP views them, right? And so yes, there's playing off against one another. It's not a coincidence that one member state is attracting quite a lot of Chinese investment, right? Quite disproportionate to its size, right? There's maybe one topic that I feel hasn't yet received enough attention. And if you look at the clean industrial deal, there's still quite a few pages that basically describe how environmental and green rules, right, can foster European industry, presumably vis-a-vis other industrial partners, right? And I think we need to become really precise about this one, right? And because it is simply true that China can be just as green as Europe is, right? They can do PPAs, they can do guarantees of origin, they can do direct lines, that's direct lines from a wind farm to a factory and a solar farm to a factory. That's what they do so much more than we do in Europe, right? That's happening all over the place. So that's even a lot easier, right? So as long as we base our LCAs and our carbon footprinting and our preferential treatment for low carbon products, as long as we base them on these sorts of characteristics, we might have, some nice green feelings, right? But at the same time, we offer on a plate, these products to the Chinese. So I would really like to say, when we start writing these rules, we should not bear in mind first, what would we do in Europe? No, we should bear in mind first, what would China do, right? And how would they deal with these kind of rules, right? And if it's just as easy, and in some cases even easier for them to comply, take recycled content. So if you look at the battery regulation, there's a requirement to have a certain amount of recycled content in batteries. It looks like a great idea until you realize that all the recycling, as Fabrice says, is going on in China. Even some production scrap from current European battery facilities is being shipped back to China for recycling. So all they need to do is send back some scrap to Europe, right? And to meet the recycling targets. And in their batteries, it's even easier. They have all the recycled content. They have tons of black mass and other elements. And so for them to comply with this requirement is extremely easy, right? So we put in a green requirement and, shooting European industry in the foot. And don't get me wrong, I'm a green, right? That's why I'm in this business, right? But using it as a tool for industrial policy is something else, right? And we need, Šefčovič 7 years ago already started to, we need a sustainable battery value chain in Europe, and then because we are so green, we will win. This has still not happened in the slightest, right? And every possible concrete follow-up is either not finished or counterproductive, right? So we need to be smarter on this one. And so again, this French eco bonus, they did it in a rather sneaky French way, and then it works, right? So by simply proclaiming European cars greener than American or Chinese ones, right? And then they suddenly get an eco bonus, and the other ones don't, and you see the market share of European cars shooting up, right? And and this discussion, I think, it's hard for a lot of people with a green heart, and including myself, right, to realize that as an industrial tool, it's not working unless we are prepared to take some major shortcuts, right? And and the reason I want to bring it up in the seminar is that it again takes like 2 pages of the Clean Industrial Deal paper yesterday, so it's still seen as a major tool, right? And I'm not against it, but we need to use it in a clever way. Yeah.
I'd like to turn to some of the questions in the Q&A, and potentially as a follow-up to your point about the French eco bonus. There's a question about joining forces between France and Germany on tackling the challenge of the auto sector transformation. And obviously these are 2 countries that have had pretty different approaches. I wonder how you would approach answering that. Maybe Jos, back to Jos, or
I'm probably not the best. Michael has a full-time job being an automotive industry observer, right? I just exited one, so I can maybe add some few things, but there's probably more to say in this topic.
Tough question. Germany, let's remind ourselves, still sells an enormous number of cars in China, especially the premium, make a lot of Audi, BMW, Mercedes, twice as many cars in China than they sell in the United States. A big market. Geely and BAIC together own almost 20% of Mercedes-Benz. They own Volvo. They own the Lotus brand. They have relationships. So where's this going? I feel as though France, on the other hand, doesn't have a whole lot to lose when it comes to retaliation out of China. Germany does. So how do we reconcile that? How do we get, in this case, Germany to have the courage to say, yeah, you know what? That business in China might eventually probably is going to go away if the trend line continues. So let's be less naive and focus on what we can build together with our neighbors here in Europe, starting with France. That's where the discussion has to start. Germany has to come around and say, Europe first, their business in China second. That's my take.
And maybe a final question on political headwinds in the US. Are they going to push the auto battery industry away from electrification? And if that happens, is Europe going to get caught flat-footed, focusing on a technology that is already dominated by the Chinese, and where the rest of the world / Europe is still catching up?
Oh, we're talking about American exceptionalism again, huh? Except when it comes to...
I think sometimes it's good to go back to the roots of where it all started, the drive to make cars more environmentally friendly, right? And it was, of course, climate, still valid, but secondly, also energy security, right? We currently have a flow insecurity, as you might call it, right? So as soon as the oil stops flowing, we have a huge problem, right? And when you have a fleet of electric cars powered by solar or wind, you have a stock dependency, right? So as soon as that stops flowing, you don't get new EVs anymore and new solar panels or new wind, but you still can produce electricity and you can still drive with the stock that you have, right? So security-wise, I think it's still an absolute no-brainer. Economically speaking, we spend still 350 billion a year importing fossil fuels, especially oil, 350 billion a year, because we don't have it, right? And if you look at the value of batteries of a fully electric car market, it's an order of magnitude less. So the economic dependence, right, is incomparable. It's, people sometimes forget that the starting point is pretty awful that we are currently having, right? And they just talk about the destination. We don't like the destination, all sorts of trouble. But let's not forget that our current situation, that there is a reason that we moved in this direction, and it's a question of who do you want to depend on, and I would say it's a law of physics that we don't have oil. It's not a law of physics that we don't have batteries, right? That's a law of engineering, if you like, right? So yeah, that's my take on this whole situation.
Great. I'd like to start wrapping us up and thank the panelists so much for your contributions. It's been a really, really insightful discussion. And also to thank our attendees for staying with us quite late in the day. To kind of summarize some of my takeaways, we've spoken about a couple different frameworks and mantras for thinking about a holistic approach to addressing strategic competitors and economic competitors in this space, particularly as we consider allocating more capital. We need to also consider defensive trade measures, which are by no means a silver bullet, and also consider loopholes that arise and anti-circumvention. Environmental policy is not trade policy. Maybe number two is, to Michael's point, we absolutely need to recognize that our power is in market access and the size of our market. In that respect, we need to ensure that reciprocity in terms that are applied to European players abroad are equally applied in Europe to foreign players. Things like tech transfers and mandatory joint ventures will help. And importantly, we need to focus on innovation and ensure upstream integration while also ensuring that downstream European demand follows. That just leaves me to wrap up and thank everyone very much for joining. Have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.